Hello, my name is Malachi Breland, and I will be discussing the history of basketball. Basketball is a sport that has over 825 million fans worldwide and continues to grow every day. The sport really has grown throughout the years, becoming more and more interesting to play and watch. People nowadays look at the players that are playing now in disbelief and amazement, thinking that their greatness was given naturally or on their own. But in reality, these players that we enjoy watching so much got their talents, skills, moves from past players that played long before them. The history of basketball is so forgotten and broken up that people don't realize the greatness that happened before the greats of our generation. Basketball wasn't always the same as it is now. When it is now, there were different rules, different types of players, and the NBA itself was different than what we know today. That's why we all need to be refreshed on how great the game of basketball was in the past and how far it has come today. Basketball was invented in 1891 in Springfield, Massachusetts by a Canadian physical educator instructor named James Naismith. The reason he invented the sport was to keep athletes indoors during the winter and for a less injury-prone sport like football back then. When the game first started, it was 9 players on each side that would attempt scoring a soccer ball, because back then they didn't have the basketball yet, into a peach basket nailed to each side of the gym on the balconies. Whichever team scored a basket, which was 1 point back then, which later changed into 2 and 3 points, and the 1 point being the free throw, had to get a ladder and get the ball out of the basket, since there was no opening at the bottom of the basket, and throw it on the floor to continue playing. Fouls were even a little bit different back then than it is today. We have different types of fouls to make it safer for the players. Back then, a foul was just hitting the ball violently when the opponent had it in their possession. If your team committed 3 of those consecutive fouls, that would lead for a point for the other team. Other than that, the people would be able to do almost anything on the court with no problem, which led into a lot of injuries and mistakes on the floor that made the game kind of broken at the time. That's why in today's game we added more rules to make the game more fair and also more competitive at the same time for people to play. We added rules like double dribbles, travels, carries, walks, fouls like reaching, personal, and flagrant. These fouls helped keep the game safe, but also enjoyable, having to make players rely more on their skills. Quarters were different too, but also kind of the same, following the college style of play, with 2 quarters of 24 minutes. Back then it was 2 quarters of 15 minutes with 5-minute breaks in between. In today's game, we have 4 12-minute quarters with a 24-second shot clock. The game back then had a lot of different rules that were later changed to improve the game and also make it more enjoyable for us to watch and play. The thing that makes the game is the players and how they act, their style, and how just overall they impacted the game. Players back then were known for their aggressiveness and how they acted towards players, refs, coaches, and even the fans. In today's game, players don't have the ability to be as physical or act a certain way without getting in trouble in a certain way. Back then, players got into fights with other players, fights with even fans, and heated arguments with their coaches and the refs. But it wasn't just how aggressive the players acted, it was the style of play that brought joy and passion to the game. Players back then loved battling in the paint, getting dunks, rebounds, layups. It made players hustle more and make everything much more competitive. But don't get me wrong, the 3-point shot was used back then, but not as much as it is today. Defense was also the biggest thing back then, because coaches and players loved it and loved seeing it being used. Hustling for steals, rushing for blocks, and even diving for a loose ball off the floor made the game fast and almost nerve-wracking to watch. Some of the best players at the start of the NBA led the way to this happening, like James Worthy, Kyle Drexler, Buck Williams, Ralph Sampson, Mark Orge, and Sidney Wirt. All great players who evolved the game of basketball. They did so. They did so with their outstanding scoring ability at the time and their defensive attitudes of the game. These players also created some of the best and more recognized players later on down the road, like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Larry Bird, Elijah Wan, or even Isaiah Thomas. These players and many other players played with so much passion, leaving statements and even stories for the future generation to be inspired by, to continue making basketball great and expanding more worldwide. Inspiring players like LeBron, Steph Curry, Kyrie Irving, James Harden, Kevin Durant, and many other players in the league today that are MVP players, defensive players, and overall players that want to carry the torch for the of all the great players that played before them. We all know the greatness and most knowing platform for live basketball is no other than the NBA. The NBA, which stands for the National Basketball Association, has been around for 73 years. Within the time, a lot has changed for the organization. Before the NBA was officially started, the first official basketball game was played in the YMCA Gymnasium in Albany, New York on January 20th, 1892. Since then, all official games have been happening at YMCA till November 1st, 1946, when the first NBA, back then was known as the BAA, game took place in Toronto, Canada. The game was played against New York Knicks and the Toronto Huskies at Maple Leaf Garden and drew in 7,000 spectators. At the start of the NBA, there was only 11 teams, which was the Boston Celtics, the Chicago Stags, the Cleveland Rebels, Detroit Falcons, New York Knickerbockers, Philadelphia Warriors, Pittsburgh's Ironmen, Providence Steamrollers, St. Louis Bombers, and Toronto Huskies, and also the Washington Capitals. Later on, this changed, leading the NBA having 30 NBA teams in total because of how much it expanded over the states and how everyone wanted to have their own team. At the beginning of the NBA, they didn't even have African-American players on teams until Earl Lloyd on October 31st, 1950, becoming the first African-American to play in the NBA for the Washington Capitals. The NBA definitely came a long way and expanded so much, starting from a small YMCA gym to being internationally known and being played worldwide for everyone to see. In conclusion, the history of basketball is definitely an interesting one and can be talked about for hours. The way that it has changed and in fact affected so many people is incredible and undeniable to anyone. The players have changed their play. Has changed their play style, and even game itself has changed. And it's also so crazy how a small idea from a physical educator has blown up big and worldwide. Hopefully, people will start to recognize and appreciate the greatness of basketball and how it all comes to help, and how the torch from each generation will be passed down to the next. Now we all need to do is just keep it going, leaving more statements, more stories, and more memories to keep basketball great.